Okay, in this lesson we're going to talk about working with percents as decimals. By the end of this lesson you should be able to say, I can use decimals to find percents of numbers, and I can use decimals and percents to find parts of a whole. Remember in our last unit when we looked at this problem, 20% of all students in period 3 math class play soccer. There are 5 students who play soccer. How many students are in the class? In this problem, we're given 2 very important pieces of information. The percent of the students who play soccer, 20%, and the number of students who play soccer, 5 students. I can use this information to set up a proportion. Remember, percent means out of 100. So, 20% written as a ratio would be 20 over 100. Since the number 5 represents the total number of students who play soccer, not all of the students in the class, I would write it on top because it is the part or the 20% of the class. In order to solve this problem, I would have to look and say, well, how do I get from 20 to 5? I do this by dividing 20 by 4. Since I divided the numerator by 4, I would then have to divide the denominator by 4. 100 divided by 4 is 25. So 25 is the number of students that are in 3rd period math. Remember, the word of means multiply. In the problems we're going to look at today, you're going to be multiplying a number by a percent. But this percent is going to be written as a decimal. When you want to find the percent of a number, you need to multiply the decimal version of the percent by the number. Well, let's look at how to turn a percent into a decimal. In the problem we just looked at, we worked with 20%. And 20% can be written as a ratio, 20 over 100. If I were to read this ratio as a fraction, I would read it 20 hundredths. If I wanted to turn this ratio into a decimal, I would write it the same way I read it as a fraction, 20 hundredths. Let's look at another example. If I wanted to take 45% and turn that into a decimal, I could first write 45% as a ratio, 45 over 100. If I were to read that as a fraction, I would say 45 hundredths. And that is how I would write it as a decimal as well, 45 hundredths. Let's look at a problem involving percents. If we were to shade 25% of the squares on this 8x8 grid, I have 2 pieces of information. One, I know the percent that I need to shade in, 25%. I also know the total number of squares in this grid. Since it's an 8x8 grid, I can multiply 8 times 8 to get 64. I would turn 25% into a decimal, and 25% as a decimal is 25 hundredths. The word of tells me I need to multiply, and I know the total that I need to multiply by. It's 8 of the 8x8 square is 64. So 25 hundredths times 64 equals 16. 16 is the number of squares I would shade in on this grid. What is 90% of 20? Just like in the previous problem, I would turn 90% into a decimal. 90% as a ratio is 90 over 100. I read that ratio 90 hundredths. That's exactly how I would write it as a decimal, 90 hundredths. Now, since I have the 0 on the end, I don't really need to worry about it right now because all those zeros at the end do not change the value of my decimal. So if I wanted to find 90% of 20, I would take the decimal version of 90% and multiply it by 20. Since there is one decimal place in my problem, I need to move the decimal back one place in my product. So 90% of 20 is 18. When you get a test back, I don't give the percents. You're given the number you got correct out of the number of possible points on the test. So if I wanted to figure out what percent of 50 is 45, I would write my score as a ratio. In this case, I got 45 out of 50 possible points. In this problem, I'm going to work backwards since I do not have the percent. To find my percent, I would turn this ratio into a decimal, and I would do that by dividing 45 by 50. Now we've talked about dividing with decimals in this unit. 50 cannot go into 45, so I need to add a decimal and a 0. 50 can go into 450 9 times. Remember, percent is out of 100. So when I work out my problem, I need to go to the hundredths place. "45% of 50 as a decimal is 90 hundredths. If I wanted to turn that 90 hundredths into a percent, I could write it as a ratio. And 90 out of 100 is 90%. So, if I got 45 out of 50 possible points on a test, I would have gotten a 90%. In your notebooks, answer questions 1 through 6. To help you out, you can go back and rewatch this video as many times as you need to. And don't forget to WSQ for tomorrow. Now pause the video and do questions 1 through 6 in your notebooks showing all work.